Lucas Jackson was like any other hard-working man in his late 20s. Every morning, he woke up at 6 a.m., pulled on his neatly ironed shirt and tie, and headed out into the bustling city of Chicago, where he worked as an analyst at a well-known financial firm. For the outside world, Lucas had made it. He had a good job, a cozy apartment in a gentrified neighborhood, and he was on the fast track toward becoming a senior partner at the firm. But for Lucas, this life was about more than just climbing the corporate ladder. It was about survival in a world where the color of his skin seemed to dictate how far he could truly go. On the surface, everything seemed fine. His colleagues were polite, his bosses liked his work, and he never gave them any reason to doubt him. But under the surface, there was always this tension. Subtle glances, uncomfortable silences when he entered a room. The occasional joke about diversity hires, whispered just a little too loudly. Lucas had grown used to it. He knew that, as a black man in corporate America, there were things he would have to let slide. After all, keeping his head down had worked for him so far. Just stay focused. He would tell himself every time he felt that familiar knot in his stomach when someone at the office made an offhand remark. There was a bigger picture to keep in mind. He couldn't let anything distract him from his goals. But despite his calm exterior, Lucas couldn't ignore the reality outside the walls of his office. The city was tense. Over the past few years, incidents of police violence had sparked protests, rallies, and unrest. Yet, even though he watched the news with growing unease, Lucas kept his distance from the activism around him. He told himself it was better this way. He had too much to lose. Still, the feeling of being constantly watched, constantly judged, never fully went away. When he walked into certain stores, the clerks would follow him with their eyes. Sometimes they'd ask, with a smile that didn't quite reach their eyes, "Can I help you find something?" But Lucas knew what that meant. He didn't fit the image of the kind of customer they expected. The same thing happened when he drove through certain neighborhoods. He noticed the way people would tense up, subtly lock their car doors, or stare a little too long as he passed by. Even in his own building, he sometimes got strange looks from his neighbors, as though they were still trying to figure out if he truly belonged there. But Lucas had learned to keep his frustrations bottled up. He didn't have time to dwell on it. He was a man with a plan, and every morning, as he stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie, he reminded himself, "You've got this. Just stay focused." After work, he'd head to the gym, work out his stress, and try to forget about the microaggressions of the day. On weekends, he'd hang out with his small circle of friends, most of them black like him, who understood the weight he carried without him having to say a word. They would laugh, joke, and try to unwind, but inevitably, the conversation would turn to the system, as they called it. Everyone had their own stories. Run-ins with police for no reason, landlords raising rent disproportionately, job opportunities slipping through their fingers despite being overqualified. It was the same story, different players. Even though Lucas nodded along, part of him still held on to the belief that maybe, just maybe, he could beat the odds if he kept playing the game right. He had worked hard to get where he was. He'd studied harder than most, sacrificed time with his family to climb the corporate ladder, and made sure to stay on the straight and narrow. But beneath his calm demeanor, Lucas knew there was always the looming threat of it all crashing down. It didn't matter how careful he was, how respectable he appeared. All it would take was one wrong moment, one wrong place, one wrong interaction for everything to unravel. Yet, he pushed those thoughts aside. That won't happen to me, he'd say quietly to himself. He wasn't like the men on the news. He wasn't part of that world. Or at least, that's what he tried to believe. It was a regular Tuesday evening when Lucas left the office. Just like any other day, he had stayed late to finish up a report. So by the time he stepped out onto the street, the sky was already a deep shade of blue, the city lights reflecting off the pavement after a brief rain shower. Lucas zipped up his coat, plugged in his headphones, and started his usual walk toward the train station. He was about 2 blocks away from the station when he noticed a police car slowing down as it passed him. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. The car didn't stop, but it was enough to set him on edge. He knew the drill. Just keep walking, don't look nervous, and everything will be fine. He told himself it was nothing, but a minute later, he saw the flashing red and blue lights again. This time right behind him. The car had turned around. 2 white officers stepped out, and Lucas could already feel the tension rising in his chest. He paused his music and took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers called out as they approached. Lucas turned to face them, forcing a polite smile. "Is there a problem, officers?" The taller of the 2 stepped forward, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "We're investigating a robbery that happened nearby," he said, his tone already accusatory. "You match the description." Lucas blinked, momentarily stunned. He hadn't done anything wrong. A robbery? He shook his head. "I think there's been a mistake. I'm just heading home from work." He gestured to the briefcase in his hand, the one he carried every day, filled with financial reports and paperwork. The second officer, shorter and stockier, stepped closer, eyeing Lucas suspiciously. "We need to see some ID." Lucas reached for his wallet, trying to keep his movements slow and deliberate. His hand shook slightly as he pulled out his driver's license. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool night air. The officers barely glanced at his ID before they began questioning him more aggressively. "Where were you an hour ago?" the tall one asked. "Who were you with? What were you doing?" Each question came faster than the last, leaving Lucas no time to explain. His pulse quickened as the situation spiraled out of control. "I just told you," Lucas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was at work. I have nothing to do with any robbery." But they weren't listening. The shorter officer moved behind him, and before Lucas could react, his arms were being yanked behind his back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists as they locked into place. "Wait, what are you doing? I haven't done anything wrong," Lucas protested, his voice rising in panic. The officers ignored him. "You're under arrest for suspicion of robbery," the tall one said flatly. A small crowd began to gather, people pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Lucas felt his face flush with humiliation. He wasn't just being arrested. He was being put on display for the world to see. His mind raced. What would his co-workers think? What about his neighbors, who would no doubt hear about this by morning? His reputation, his career, everything he had worked so hard to build. It was all hanging by a thread. And for what? For being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was it simply because he was a black man walking home alone at night? As they shoved him into the back of the police car, Lucas's thoughts were a jumbled mess. How could this be happening? He had followed all the rules. He had stayed out of trouble. But none of that seemed to matter now. The ride to the station was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Lucas stared out the window, his mind replaying the events of the last few minutes over and over. He still couldn't believe it. This wasn't supposed to happen to him. He was the guy who avoided protests, the one who believed in keeping his head down and staying out of trouble. But none of that had saved him from this moment. When they arrived at the station, Lucas was pulled out of the car and led inside, still in handcuffs. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to explain this, how to prove his innocence. But as the officers began processing him, fingerprinting him like a criminal, the weight of the situation hit him full force. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't going to be as simple as explaining himself and walking out. Lucas was now part of a system he had spent his entire life trying to avoid, and there was no easy way out. Lucas sat in the cold, dimly lit cell, his hands trembling slightly as the weight of the situation settled in. The distant sound of a door slamming echoed through the station, sending a chill down his spine. His eyes scanned the small, barren room. Metal bars, a narrow bench, and the lingering smell of disinfectant mixed with the stale air. He had never imagined himself in a place like this. The other men in the holding cell, mostly people of color like him, looked worn out, some slumped against the walls, others staring blankly ahead. Lucas felt out of place, as if he didn't belong here. But in the back of his mind, a voice kept telling him that in the eyes of the system, he was no different from anyone else in that room. Hours passed, but Lucas couldn't sleep. His mind was racing, his thoughts filled with the faces of the two officers who had arrested him. How could they have been so sure he was guilty? How could they have dismissed his explanation so easily? It didn't make sense, except deep down it did. He had heard enough stories from his friends and seen enough news to know that being black in America often meant being guilty until proven innocent. His phone had been confiscated, so he had no way to call his family or his boss. He could already imagine the fallout. His mother, worried sick when she didn't hear from him. His boss, wondering why Lucas hadn't shown up to work the next day. The shame and anxiety gnawed at him, making the night feel even longer. A guard finally came by to offer him a meal, a tray with a stale sandwich and a carton of milk. But Lucas wasn't hungry. The knot in his stomach wouldn't let him eat. He just sat there, staring at the wall, replaying the events over and over in his head. How had this happened? He had done everything right, followed every rule, worked hard to prove himself in a society that always seemed to question his worth. Yet here he was, handcuffed and treated like a criminal for simply walking home from work. The hours dragged on, and with each passing moment, Lucas's anger began to grow. It started as a low simmer in the back of his mind, a quiet disbelief at the injustice of it all. But as the minutes ticked by, the anger turned into something more, a deep, burning resentment. This wasn't just about the arrest. It was about all the little things that had led up to this moment. The snide comments at work, the suspicious looks from shopkeepers, the constant feeling that no matter how much he accomplished, it would never be enough to shield him from the prejudice that followed him like a shadow. Suddenly, Lucas was jolted from his thoughts by the sound of keys jingling. A guard approached the cell, his expression bored as he unlocked the door. "Jackson, you're up," he muttered. Lucas stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. He was led out of the cell and down a long hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what was coming next. Was this the moment where he'd finally get to explain himself? Would someone listen? He was brought into a small, bare interrogation room, where one of the officers from earlier was waiting. The tall one, the one who had spoken to him during the arrest. Lucas felt his jaw clench, but he forced himself to stay calm. He sat down across from the officer, who looked at him with a blank expression, as if Lucas were just another file to be processed. "We've got some questions for you," the officer said, opening a folder in front of him. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "Look, I already told you I was coming from work. I had nothing to do with any robbery." The officer ignored his statement and began asking a series of probing questions about his whereabouts, his job, even his personal life. Lucas answered each one as calmly as he could, but with every word, it became clearer that the officer wasn't interested in the truth. He was trying to find a way to fit Lucas into the story they had already constructed. After what felt like an eternity, the officer finally leaned back in his chair and closed the folder. "All right, we'll see about this. For now, you're being held for further questioning." Lucas's stomach dropped. Held for further questioning. His voice cracked slightly. "I haven't done anything wrong. You can call my employer, check my alibi, anything. I was at work all day." But the officer just shrugged. "We'll see. For now, you're staying here." With that, Lucas was led back to his cell, his frustration boiling over into quiet rage. He couldn't believe it. He was being held with no real evidence. Just a vague suspicion that he might have been involved in something he had no part in. As he sat back down on the cold metal bench, Lucas's mind swirled with anger, fear, and confusion. He had always believed in the system, that if you followed the rules, worked hard, and kept your head down, you could make it. But tonight, the cracks in that belief were beginning to show. Lucas woke up the next morning to the harsh sound of a guard banging on the cell door. His body was stiff from sleeping on the hard bench, his neck sore from the awkward position he had been in all night. He felt disoriented, the weight of everything that had happened still pressing down on him. For a brief moment, he had forgotten where he was, but the cold metal of the handcuffs and the dim, gray light filtering into the cell quickly reminded him. A different officer stood by the door this time, younger than the others, but his face was just as expressionless. "You've got a visitor," he said flatly. Lucas sat up, surprised. A visitor? His mind raced. Who could possibly be here for him? He was led down another long hallway and into a small visitation room with a glass divider. As he walked in, his heart jumped. On the other side of the glass was his mother, her face etched with worry, but her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "Mom!" Lucas's voice cracked as he sat down. He picked up the phone, his hands trembling. "I'm so sorry you have to see me like this." His mother shook her head, her expression softening for just a moment. "Lucas, you don't have anything to be sorry for. This isn't your fault." Lucas's throat tightened. He had always tried to protect his mother from his struggles, to show her that he was thriving despite the challenges he faced. But now, sitting there in a police station, he felt exposed in a way he never had before. "They're saying I was involved in a robbery," Lucas muttered, his voice heavy with frustration. "But I didn't do anything. I was just walking home from work." His mother nodded. "I know, Lucas. I believe you, and I've already spoken to a lawyer. We're going to fight this." Lucas blinked, stunned. "A lawyer? Mom, how did you?" She cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Don't worry about that right now. We'll figure it out. The important thing is getting you out of here." For the first time since his arrest, Lucas felt a small glimmer of hope. His mother had always been a force to be reckoned with, and seeing her in action now, standing up for him when he felt so powerless, filled him with a renewed sense of strength. "The lawyer is working on getting you released on bail," she explained. "But it might take some time. I just wanted to see you, to make sure you're okay." Lucas nodded, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I'm okay," he said, though he wasn't sure how true that was. His emotions were a tangled mess of anger, fear, and confusion. But seeing his mother, hearing her voice, made everything seem just a little more bearable. "I know it's hard," his mother continued, her voice soft but steady. "But you've always been strong, Lucas. You've faced adversity your whole life, and you've always come out on top. Don't let them break you." Lucas swallowed hard, nodding. "I won't." The conversation didn't last long. The guards didn't allow much time for visitors, but by the end of it, Lucas felt like he had regained some of his footing. His mother's words echoed in his mind as he was led back to his cell. "Don't let them break you." The rest of the day passed slowly, the hours crawling by as Lucas waited for any news. He tried to keep himself occupied, but the anxiety gnawed at him. Every time he heard the jingle of keys or the shuffle of footsteps in the hall, his heart leapt, hoping it was the guard coming to tell him he was free to go. It wasn't until late that evening that his lawyer, a sharp, confident woman named Marissa, finally arrived. She sat across from him in the same visitation room, her demeanor calm but focused. "I've reviewed your case," she said, flipping open a file. "And from what I can see, there's no solid evidence tying you to this robbery. This is clearly a case of racial profiling." Lucas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "So, what happens now?" "I'm working on getting you released on bail," Marissa explained. "But the real fight will come in court. We need to be prepared to push back hard against these charges. The system isn't always fair, Lucas, especially when it comes to cases like this. But we have a strong case." Lucas nodded, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. He was grateful to have someone like Marissa on his side, but the thought of having to go through a lengthy court battle made his stomach churn. "I know this is overwhelming," Marissa continued, her voice steady. "But you have people in your corner. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win." As Lucas was led back to his cell once more, he felt a shift within himself. The fear and uncertainty were still there, but now there was something else too, a quiet, simmering determination. He wasn't going to let this define him. He wasn't going to let them break him, just like his mother had said. This wasn't just about getting out of jail. This was about standing up for himself, for his dignity, and for every other black man who had been through the same unjust system. He was ready to fight. Lucas had barely been back home for 24 hours when the calls started coming in. First, it was his close friends, checking in to make sure he was okay. Then came the neighbors, people he hadn't even realized had heard about his arrest, offering words of support and encouragement. But the biggest surprise came from the community itself. People he didn't even know, reaching out, expressing outrage over the injustice of what had happened to him. It started small. A few local activists caught wind of his story and shared it on social media. Within hours, the post went viral. Suddenly, Lucas's face was plastered across timelines and news feeds, his story being shared far beyond the small circle of his friends and family. People were outraged, not just at the injustice he had faced, but at the larger pattern it represented. For so many in the black community, Lucas's story was all too familiar. They had seen it happen to their friends, their brothers, their fathers. And now it had happened to him. One afternoon, as Lucas was trying to settle back into a routine, his phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer, Marissa. "Turn on the local news," it read. "Something's happening." Curious, Lucas grabbed the remote and flicked on the TV. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. Outside the police station where he had been held just days before, a crowd had gathered. Hundreds of people, maybe even more, holding signs, chanting for justice. Some of the signs bore his name. Others simply read, "Enough is enough." Lucas's hands trembled as he watched the scene unfold on the screen. He had never seen anything like it before. People of all races, backgrounds, and ages coming together to stand against the injustice he had faced. The reporter's voice was calm, but the passion of the crowd behind her was undeniable. "This is a peaceful demonstration," she was saying. "But the message is clear. The community will not stand by and watch as one of their own is treated unfairly by the police. They are demanding accountability." Lucas's mother, who had been sitting quietly at the kitchen table, glanced up at the TV and gasped. "Lucas," she said, her voice filled with a mix of pride and disbelief. "Look at this. Look at what they're doing for you." He could barely believe it himself. How had his story, his arrest, become the catalyst for something so much bigger? He felt a mixture of gratitude and guilt. Part of him wanted to be out there with them, standing in solidarity, but another part of him was still reeling from the trauma of what he had been through. The next few days were a whirlwind. Reporters started calling, asking for interviews. Local news stations wanted to feature his story, to use his experience as a jumping-off point for a larger conversation about police brutality and systemic racism. Lucas wasn't sure if he was ready for all the attention, but Marissa encouraged him to use the platform. "This is bigger than you, Lucas," she told him one afternoon. "Your story can help bring attention to what's happening across the country. People are listening. This is your chance to speak up." So he did. He gave interviews. He spoke at community meetings, and he even agreed to stand before the crowd outside the police station during one of the protests. The first time he stepped up to the microphone, his hands were shaking, but as soon as he saw the faces in the crowd, their eyes filled with hope and determination, his nerves faded. "I didn't ask for any of this," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "I didn't ask to become a symbol for what's wrong with the system. But I can't stand here and pretend that what happened to me is unique. This happens to people like me every day. The only difference is that now, we're fighting back." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Lucas wasn't done. He felt something inside him ignite, a sense of purpose he had never felt before. "We can't let this continue," he said, his voice rising with each word. "We can't just sit by and watch as our brothers, our sisters, our sons, and our daughters are treated like criminals because of the color of their skin. We have to stand together. We have to demand justice." The energy in the crowd was electric. People were chanting his name, raising their fists in solidarity. For the first time since his arrest, Lucas felt powerful. Not because he had all the answers, but because he knew he wasn't alone. As he stepped down from the stage, Marissa caught his eye, giving him a nod of approval. "You did good," she said. People needed to hear that. Lucas exhaled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. This fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he had a voice in it. The buzz surrounding Lucas's case continued to grow. News outlets were calling him the face of resilience, and social media was filled with hashtags supporting him. But with the spotlight came pressure. Lucas found himself caught between the overwhelming support of the community and the daunting reality of facing his accusers in court. As the days turned into weeks, Marissa worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and preparing for the upcoming trial. Lucas was grateful for her dedication, but the weight of the situation was heavy on his shoulders. He often found himself awake at night, staring at the ceiling, contemplating the road ahead. Would he truly get justice? Or was this just another battle against a system designed to keep people like him down? One afternoon, as Lucas and Marissa sat in her office, going over case documents, she leaned back in her chair and looked him in the eye. "Lucas, I need you to be ready for this. The defense will try to discredit you. They'll dig into your past, your character, everything. We need to stay focused." Lucas nodded, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "I understand, but how can I stay focused when everything feels so chaotic? Every time I turn on the news, I see people talking about me, dissecting my life like it's entertainment." Marissa sighed, her expression softening. "That's the price of being in the public eye. But remember, you're fighting for something bigger than yourself. You're fighting for justice, for accountability, and that's worth the noise." Lucas took a deep breath, trying to absorb her words. He knew she was right, but the anxiety still gnawed at him. The trial was set to begin soon, and he could already feel the pressure mounting. It wasn't just his freedom on the line. It was his reputation, his future. As the trial date approached, Lucas made a point to attend every community meeting he could. He spoke openly about his experiences, sharing not just his story, but also encouraging others to speak up against their own injustices. Each time he took the stage, the supportive chants and cheers from the crowd fueled his determination. Then, the day of the trial finally arrived. Lucas, dressed in a sharp suit, determined to present himself as someone who was not just a victim, but a man ready to reclaim his narrative. He felt a mix of nerves and adrenaline as he entered the courthouse, the air thick with anticipation. The hallway was buzzing with reporters, families, and supporters. Marissa met him at the entrance, giving him a reassuring smile. "You ready for this?" she asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Lucas replied, swallowing hard. Inside the courtroom, Lucas was struck by the formal atmosphere. The polished wooden benches, the judge's imposing seat, and the quiet tension that filled the air. As he took his place at the plaintiff's table, he could feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him. The proceedings began, and the tension in the room was palpable. Marissa presented her case first, outlining the events leading to Lucas's arrest and highlighting the lack of evidence against him. She painted a picture of a young man simply trying to get home from work, unjustly targeted by the police. Then came the defense's turn. Lucas's heart sank as the defense attorney, a slick man in a tailored suit, began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice smooth and confident, "the evidence will show that Mr. Jackson's story doesn't add up. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he was arrested based on reasonable suspicion." Lucas clenched his fists, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. The attorney continued, twisting Lucas's words and trying to paint him as a suspect rather than a victim. The first witness was an officer who had been involved in the arrest. Lucas listened, feeling a mix of disbelief and frustration as the officer recounted the events, conveniently omitting crucial details that painted Lucas in a favorable light. The courtroom was filled with tension, and Lucas could feel the weight of the jury's gaze upon him. He couldn't help but wonder how they perceived him. Did they see a young man wronged by the system, or did they see a potential criminal? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it was Lucas's turn to take the stand. As he walked up to the witness box, he took a deep breath, focusing on the faces in the crowd, his mother, his friends, the community that had rallied behind him. He needed to stay strong, to show them that he was more than just a statistic. "Mr. Jackson," the defense attorney began, his tone condescending, "can you explain why you were in the vicinity of the robbery?" Lucas met his gaze, his voice steady. "I was walking home from work. I have a job at a local restaurant, and I was just trying to get back to my family." The attorney pressed on, trying to undermine his credibility, but Lucas held his ground. He spoke about his experiences, the challenges he faced as a black man in America, and the unjust treatment he had endured. With each word, he felt the support of the crowd behind him, bolstering his courage. As he stepped down from the stand, he could see Marissa's approving nod. He had told his truth, and no matter the outcome of the trial, that felt powerful. The trial dragged on, each day feeling like an eternity. Lucas found it exhausting, both emotionally and mentally. The courtroom became a battleground where his past was dissected, and every detail of his life was scrutinized. But beneath the weight of it all, something shifted. The community remained steadfast in their support, and Lucas felt their energy fueling him, giving him the strength to push through. Marissa was relentless. She called witness after witness, each one strengthening their case. They brought in friends and co-workers who testified to Lucas's character, speaking about his dedication, kindness, and the community work he had done over the years. Each voice added a layer of authenticity to his defense. Then came a pivotal moment in the trial. Marissa called one of the bystanders from the day of the arrest. This young woman, a neighbor who had witnessed the whole incident, stepped onto the stand. Lucas's heart raced as he watched her take a seat and look at him, offering a reassuring smile. "Can you tell the court what you saw that day?" Marissa prompted. The woman took a deep breath. "I was just getting home from work when I saw the police stop Lucas. He was doing nothing wrong, just walking down the street. I was shocked at how they treated him, like he was a criminal. I yelled out to them, but they didn't listen." Lucas felt a rush of relief wash over him. Her words echoed the truth he had been trying to communicate for weeks. As she spoke, he saw the jury leaning in, engaged and attentive. The defense attorney, however, was quick to attack. "And you expect this jury to believe you were really watching this incident closely enough to recall every detail? You're just a bystander." The woman squared her shoulders, her voice unwavering. "I was watching because I was concerned. I know Lucas. He's a good person, and I couldn't stand to see him treated that way." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Lucas felt a flicker of hope. If they could see him through the eyes of those who knew him, if they could understand that he was not just a statistic, maybe there was a chance. As the trial continued, the prosecution finally presented their key evidence, a shaky video taken from a cell phone during the incident. The footage showed Lucas being detained, but was too grainy and unclear to definitively prove any wrongdoing on his part. Still, the defense seized the opportunity. Marissa stood up, addressing the jury. What you're seeing here is a clear example of police overreach. Lucas was arrested without just cause, and this video only adds to the confusion surrounding the events of that day. Lucas felt a swell of pride as Marissa eloquently articulated his case. The audience's reactions echoed his own feelings. This was not just about him. It was about the systemic issues that plague so many in their community. The trial reached its climax when Marissa called Lucas's mother to the stand. Lucas watched her as she walked forward, her head held high, radiating strength. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice steady. "Can you tell the court about your son and the kind of person he is?" Marissa asked gently. His mother paused, glancing at Lucas. Lucas has always been a caring and hard-working young man. He's the type of person who helps others, who stands up for what's right. I raised him to be proud of who he is, and it breaks my heart to see him go through this. As she spoke, tears filled Lucas's eyes. Hearing his mother's unwavering faith in him was both humbling and empowering. She was fighting for him just as fiercely as he was fighting for himself. The defense attorney interrupted, attempting to undermine her credibility. "So, you're saying that your son is incapable of wrongdoing? That's quite a claim." His mother met the attorney's gaze head-on, refusing to back down. "No, I'm saying that he deserves the chance to be treated fairly. He deserves to be heard. Every person does." The jury seemed to shift, their expressions revealing a mix of empathy and understanding. Lucas could feel the tides turning, and he hoped beyond hope that they could see the truth behind the facade of the accusations against him. Finally, after what felt like an endless week, Marissa stood to deliver her closing arguments. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice strong and unwavering. "This case isn't just about Lucas. It's about accountability. It's about recognizing that our justice system must do better. We cannot let fear dictate our actions, especially when it leads to the unjust targeting of innocent individuals. We must stand up for justice, not just for Lucas, but for everyone who has been silenced by the system." Lucas felt a surge of pride, a sense of purpose that coursed through him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever faced injustice. As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, Lucas took a moment to breathe. He looked at his mother, who smiled back at him, her eyes filled with unwavering hope. The waiting felt unbearable, each second stretching into an eternity as they all sat in tense silence. When the jury returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as the judge asked for the verdict. "Your Honor," the foreman said, "we find the defendant not guilty." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, time stopped. Then, as the weight of the verdict sank in, the courtroom erupted into cheers. Lucas felt a rush of relief and disbelief wash over him. He was free, finally free. The aftermath of the trial felt surreal. The cheers of support still echoed in Lucas's mind as he stepped out of the courthouse, his heart soaring with a mix of relief and newfound purpose. The community had stood by him, and now they were ready to embrace the next chapter of their fight for justice together. As Lucas walked down the steps, he was met by a sea of familiar faces, friends, family, and supporters who had rallied around him throughout this ordeal. Cameras flashed, and voices filled the air with chants of solidarity. It felt like a homecoming, but he knew the journey was far from over. "Lucas, over here!" A voice called out, and he turned to see Marissa pushing her way through the crowd, a proud smile on her face. "You did it," she exclaimed, wrapping him in a tight hug. "I knew you could." "I couldn't have done it without you," Lucas replied, feeling a wave of gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me." As they pulled apart, Marissa's expression grew serious. "Now that the trial is behind you, we need to keep the momentum going. Your voice matters, and we can use this moment to push for real change." Lucas nodded, determination surging within him. He knew that his fight was just beginning. The system that had wronged him was still in place, and he had a responsibility to use his experience to help others. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Lucas attended community meetings, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up against injustice. He partnered with local organizations focused on police reform and social justice, lending his voice to the cause. It felt empowering to advocate for change, and he found himself fueled by the stories of others who had faced similar struggles. One afternoon, Lucas stood before a gathering of community members, sharing not only his experience, but also the lessons he had learned along the way. "We have the power to demand accountability," he said, his voice steady. "Our stories matter, and when we come together, we can create real change." As he spoke, he saw the faces of those around him, young and old, filled with hope and determination. They were ready to join him in the fight. The solidarity in the room was palpable, and he knew that together they could amplify their voices. A few months later, Lucas found himself standing on a stage in front of a much larger crowd, this time at a citywide rally for police reform. The atmosphere was electric, filled with energy and passion. Activists from all over the city had come to share their stories and demand change. As Lucas took the microphone, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. He had come so far, and now he was ready to inspire others. "I stand here today not just as Lucas Jackson, but as a representation of every person who has faced injustice," he began, his voice ringing out across the crowd. He recounted the moments of fear and doubt, but he also spoke about the strength he found in community and support. "Together, we have the power to make a difference. We cannot allow our voices to be silenced. We must stand up, speak out, and fight for justice." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Lucas felt a surge of adrenaline. He was no longer just a victim. He was a leader, a voice for change. In that moment, he realized that his journey had transformed him, igniting a passion for activism he never knew he had. In the months that followed, Lucas became increasingly involved in advocacy work. He worked closely with organizations focusing on police reform, lobbying for legislation that would promote accountability and transparency within law enforcement. He spoke at schools, inspiring young people to understand their rights and encouraging them to stand against discrimination and injustice. As the movement gained traction, Lucas was invited to participate in national discussions on police reform, sharing his story on larger platforms. He was no longer just Lucas Jackson from the neighborhood. He had become a symbol of resilience and hope for countless others. One evening, while sitting at home, Lucas reflected on how far he had come. He had faced the darkness of despair and emerged stronger, fueled by the support of his community and the desire for change. He felt grateful for the journey that had shaped him into the person he was becoming. But even as he celebrated his accomplishments, Lucas knew the fight wasn't over. There were still countless others who needed a voice, and he was determined to continue advocating for justice, equality, and understanding. As he prepared for his next speaking engagement, he glanced at a photo on his wall, one of the community rally after his trial. He smiled, feeling a sense of pride and purpose wash over him. This was just the beginning, and together with his community, they would continue to make waves. Lucas was ready to lead the charge, driven by the hope that one day, no one would have to face the same injustices he had endured. The journey was long, but with determination, love, and unity, he believed they could create a future where justice was truly served.